This is a workshop, so there's going to be many opportunities for you to engage in active learning. So you're going to be doing most of the work, not me. So what you'll need is either a computer or a piece of paper and something to write on it, or if you don't have either of those, you'll need your phone out. So you'll be writing some things down. So while you're getting those things out, I'll introduce myself. Hi, my name is Kim Schlesinger. I'm a web development instructor at Galvanize. I am an educator. I have been for a long time, and I think I will probably be for the rest of my life. I have my undergrad degree in music education, and I taught elementary school music, and I did training in the Kodai method. Taught that for 2 years. After teaching music, I transitioned to become a special education teacher. I taught special education for 4 years. I did my training through Teach for America and got my master's degree in teaching in special education. After that, I started working for the Teach for America Summer Teacher Training Institute, which is, instead of a 4-year degree, it's when people who have bachelor's degrees go through an alternative program. It's 5 weeks, it's immersive, it's incredibly intense, and that's where I learned a lot about teaching and learning, and especially teaching and learning for adults. And so a lot of the things that you'll be doing today are a result of my work at Teach for America. Also, a lot of the techniques that we're going to be practicing are from this book. It's called Teach Like a Champion. Before this book, there was a myth that teaching was something that you just sort of inherited or were good at, and there was nothing you could do to change it. The author of this book, Doug Lemov, and his team, they went into thousands of classrooms where teachers were getting really good results with their students, and they started observing them and seeing patterns that highly successful teachers do certain things. They all do certain things, and they were able to look at those patterns, write them down, name them, and started training teachers on how to use those techniques. So if you're interested in teaching, that is a great book to look at. So before we get started, I want to tell you about some meetups. There's some really exciting teaching meetups happening in the Denver area. So the first one, it's the Denver Ed Tech Instructors. This meetup is designed for people who are teaching at software boot camps or universities. It is a brand new meetup. Our first meetup is on Monday, September 11th, and it'll be at Galvanize Platt. The format of those meetups will be very similar to this talk, where we'll discuss a technique, and then we'll practice and give feedback, and then reflect at the end. Another meetup that you might be interested in is called the Hybrid and Online Education Meetup. It's started by 2 educators who are talking about what's going on in online education. So if you're interested in curriculum design or teaching remotely, that would be a great meetup to attend. And then the last one is called Education Innovation at Ed Garage. This meetup is targeted for people who are building educational technology platforms or software. A lot of current and former teachers and software developers. This meetup happens really regularly. It's at lunch at the Taxi building at the Ed Garage, which is a co-working space for ed tech companies. So another great meetup if you're interested. All right, so we're gonna get started. By the end of this workshop, you'll be able to do these 3 things. The first one is you'll be able to write 2 to 3 learning objectives that meet something called the 4M criteria. The second thing you'll be able to do is describe and demonstrate a teaching technique called Postive. And the third thing you'll be able to do is describe and demonstrate a teaching technique called targeted questioning. We're going to start with the first objective, that you're able to write 2 to 3 learning objectives that meet the 4M criteria. So what is a learning objective. Learning objective is a goal. It's a description of what your students will know and be able to do by the end of a lesson. And it sounds simple and intuitive, like, yeah, you want to set goals and you want to meet them, but when you are teaching and you want your students to have a transformative experience, you want to write really good learning objectives because you're thinking about how is my student going to be transformed, what are they going to know, and what are they going to be able to do at the end of the lesson that they couldn't do before. So learning objectives are key. If you want to be a transformative teacher and really change the lives of your students, you need to think about these things. So that's why they're so important. So the objective is that you can write objectives that meet the 4M criteria. This is the criteria. It's these 4 different things. A learning objective should be manageable. It should be measurable. It should be made first, meaning that it's the first thing you do and create when you're writing a lesson. And the learning objective should be all-encompassing of the most important things that students need to know. So manageable. Manageable means that the learning objectives that you create for your students can be achieved by the end of a lesson. And so if you see this format, by the end of a specified time period, the student will be able to. That's when you're thinking about, can my students actually do the things that I want them to do in the time that I have? So I've got an hour for this workshop. I picked a really ambitious set of objectives, but I think that we can do it within this 1 hour. And that's what I was thinking about, is this manageable? You order your objectives, and again, you're just thinking about what is the time that I have, and can I make sure that my students can meet those objectives in that time period. The second thing is that your objectives should be measurable, and when you boil it down, you as the instructor, after you've covered the objective, you should be able to evaluate the student's work and say, yes, they've achieved that objective, or no, they haven't. It should be really obvious and clear to you. And the way that we ensure that our objectives are measurable is we use something called Bloom's taxonomy verbs. So Bloom's taxonomy is a way of organizing different rigors of thought. And at the bottom of the taxonomy are just basic knowledge and comprehension and recall things. So if you want students to be able to describe something or explain something or do something in a rote way, have something memorized, it's at the bottom of the taxonomy. As you move up the taxonomy, the rigor of thinking and the complexity of what students are doing goes up. And so we see at the bottom is knowledge. As we move up, there's application. And then when you're building things, when you're combining things, and then when you're creating systems, that's when you're at the top of the taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is one thing. In a minute, you're going to be Googling stuff, and you want to look for Bloom's taxonomy verbs. Because the verbs are the things that you get to decide, yes, can the student do it, or no, they can't. So if we look at the bottom of the taxonomy with knowledge, one verb I use to write objectives a lot is describe. So by the end of this lesson, students will be able to describe a technique. I can ask a student, hey, can you just tell me about that technique? Or I can have them write it down, and that's where I can say yes or no. If we go up the taxonomy, let's see, compare is in the analysis row. And so if I say, all right, I want students to be able to compare Vue.js and Angular and describe how they're similar and how they're different. Again, I can ask the student verbally or in writing, make that comparison. So the verbs are key in making objectives measurable. So these are some examples of well-written objectives. You see the time, by the end of this workshop, you will be able to. And then you see 4 objectives. So I want you to really notice the verbs. So the first objective is that students are able to inspect DOM nodes and elements. And I've taught this lesson before, and the way that I ask students to prove it to me is I just say, use your dev tools and show me how you can inspect the DOM. The second objective is that students are able to modify existing DOM elements. So when I'm evaluating that, I say, here is something in the DOM, now I want you to change the value. The third one is that students can create new DOM elements, and that's when I ask them, hey, I've given you this page, and I want you to add an unordered list at the bottom. And then the last one, describe the document object model. That's one where verbally or in writing, students are showing whether or not they understand the DOM. So those are well-written objectives. Students, it's a long lesson, but students have enough time to do all of that by the end of the day, and I, as the instructor, can give the yes or the no based off of those verbs. These are some non-examples. So the first one is understand the DOM. So if we think about, is this objective measurable? How do you objectively decide whether or not somebody understands something? It's a little bit in the gray area, and so that's why you look at the Bloom's verbs and you pick one that's a little bit more precise. Explain, describe is much clearer than understand. And another non-example is complete a project that uses JavaScript. That's a great end goal, but if you want to really break down the skills that students are doing, you want to break it down into more granular objectives. All right, so right now it's your turn. If you have a lesson in mind that you might be teaching in the future, use that as your content. If you're like, I'm not planning on teaching anything in the future, I want you to imagine that you're teaching a workshop. It's for people who are brand new to web development and they're learning about how to write a basic page using HTML and linking it up with CSS. So you're going to write 2 to 3 learning objectives, and you're thinking about, are they manageable and are they measurable? And you want to find and use verbs from Bloom's taxonomy. So actually write these down. Either type them on your computer, write them in your notebook, or use a note on your phone. But let's take 5 minutes and have you write those objectives. And I'll be walking around to offer assistance if you need it. So some awesome things I'm seeing. People have a list of Bloom's taxonomy verbs pulled up. You're writing your objectives. It's really quiet. You're absolutely welcome to talk to your neighbor. One thing I haven't seen much of is the measurable part. And so you just put a statement by the end of this workshop, by the end of this lesson. You want to specify that time block. So you're thinking, can I actually cover all of these objectives in an hour or so? It's the end of our 5 minutes. So what you're going to do now is you're going to turn and talk with somebody next to you who is doing that activity and just share out the list of objectives that you wrote. Keep your ears and eyes open if the person that you're sharing with wrote really good objectives. I'm going to ask for volunteers to share out. So give them that suggestion if they're really good. So turn and talk with your neighbor and just share the learning objectives that you wrote. So I'm curious what you wrote, looking for 2 to 3 volunteers to share out their learning objectives and how they frame them. Any volunteers? All right, Matt?
Our lesson's on pure functions. By the end of this workshop, you'll be able to describe what a pure function is.
By the end of this workshop, you'll be able to describe what a pure function is.
Give an example of a pure function.
Give an example of a pure function.
And write a pure function that adds, multiplies, subtracts, and divides 2 numbers.
And write a pure function that adds, multiplies, divides 2 numbers. Excellent. Give him a round of applause. That was really good. So, if I'm evaluating with the first 2 parts of the 4M criteria, are those manageable? Do those seem manageable to you? So you said by the end of this workshop? So usually workshops between 1 hour and 2 hours, and he's got 3 objectives. So yeah, that seems pretty good to me. You might have to think that through a little bit more deeply. But those were really, really measurable. So can you say the first one?
Describe what a pure function is.
Describe what a pure function is. So if you're the instructor and you've covered that objective with your students, how are you going to check and say, yep, you can describe what a pure function is, or no, I think I need to reteach that again. So what's a way you can check? So think about that. How can you check a describe objective? What do you think? Looking for a volunteer. How could I measure whether or not that a student can do that? Yeah.
Could I have your students maybe write it down or recite it?
Absolutely. You could say, take a moment and write down your description of what is a pure function, or have them, I forgot the second thing you said.
Just recite it.
Yeah, just recite it, just like I'm doing now. How is this measurable? I'm asking you to talk about it. Good. Go to your, will you say your last objective?
The last objective is write a pure function that adds, multiplies, subtracts, and divides 2 numbers.
So write a pure function that adds, subtracts, multiplies, divides 2 numbers. I really like that because it's very specific. Matt could have said write a pure function, and that would be a fine objective, but he's really narrowing the scope so that you know exactly what you have to do as the student approaching that learning objective. Excellent. Looking for one more volunteer to share out the learning objectives that they wrote. Yeah.
Okay. I did how to learn Xavier by the end of a half-hour workshop.
Okay, how to learn Xavier by the end of a half-hour workshop.
And the first objective was to apply ZAPs to automate. And the second was to arrange the ZAP autoflow.
Excellent. So apply Zapier, is that how you say it?
In Xavier, you can make little ZAPs.
Okay, so apply a Zap. Say your first objective again.
Apply ZAPs to automate.
Apply zaps to automate, and then your second objective?
Arrange the zap auto flow.
Arrange the zap auto flow. Cool. I don't know about Zapier. How do you apply zaps to automate?
So you would need to choose different ones that would work for your automation, whether it's you're going into MailChimp or you're going into Google Sheets. So you'll choose which you're going to apply.
Okay.
And then set your different steps for each of those. Arrange the auto flow.
Excellent. So that was actually really beautiful. When I asked her what you have to do to achieve that objective, she just described the skill, like what you actually have to do, and whether she knows it or not, like she described how she's going to teach it. Like step 1, you choose which thing you're going to automate it with. Step 2. Excellent. So how would you determine whether or not a student could do that objective?
It would be something on their screen and seeing if they're picking those things that are appropriate for what they're trying to achieve, and then see if their sequence kind of sets it up to have the different steps to plug those in.
Excellent. So the thing, she's doing an application level objective, and so you as the instructor either have to like stand behind them and watch them do them, or you can ask them to do a screencast and upload it to YouTube and then send you the video so you can evaluate it asynchronously. But that's a really good example of, it becomes more complex as you move through the taxonomy. With the more complex skills, you have to get a little bit more creative as the person assessing it. So, we didn't give her a round of applause. Give her a round of applause. So we're evaluating objectives against this 4M criteria. We've talked about what it means to be manageable, what it means to be measurable. The last 2 are really simple. You should write your objectives before you do any other planning for your lesson. You might have thought of a really cool activity that you want your students to work through, or you're really excited about something, but your lesson objectives are the first principles that you're working from, and so start with those first. They're the core. The second thing is that the objectives should be the most important things that students have to learn. In traditional K-12 education, we use standards to evaluate whether what we're teaching is the most important thing. It may be different for you. You might be leading a meetup or teaching a workshop and may not have standards, so you just have to think, are these the most important things that my students need to learn to have this knowledge or apply these skills? So, our learning objectives, we just covered objective number 1, that you can write 2 to 3 learning objectives that meet the 4M criteria. After you walk out of this workshop, somebody may say to you, where were you? And you'll say, I was at How to Be a Kick-Ass Teacher. And they'll say, well, what did you learn? I wanted to go to that, but I couldn't because I went to something else. So I want you to think, what would you say about that first objective? How would you describe that in your own words to somebody who wants to know? And then turn and talk with somebody next to you and share that explanation. writing learning objectives that meet the 4M criteria. You don't have to have the 4M criteria memorized, just your own, in your own words, someone who hasn't said anything. Peter.
So figure out what you want your students to get out of a lesson and then build the lesson around those objectives.
I like that. Figure out what you want your students to get out of the lesson and then build your lesson around that. The thing I like about that is it's student-centered and not teacher-centered. You care deeply about what students are walking away with, and what you do is actually secondary. All right, so that was objective number 1. We're going to move on to objective number 2. Now you can notice my verbs and critique me. Objective number 2 is that you can describe and demonstrate a teaching technique called Postive. So, Postive is it's a very simple technique. It means that you put your objectives up somewhere visual where your students can see it. If I had a whiteboard here, I would have my objectives written there. That's how I prefer to do it. But I wasn't sure what the setup was going to be in here, so I put them in my slides. So you post your objectives in a visible location, and then you do 3 things. 1, you go over your objectives at the beginning of the lesson. 2, you bring attention back to the objective after you've covered it. And 3, you go over your objectives at the end of the lesson. So like Peter said, learning objectives are goals for the students, and you want to constantly be drawing their attention back to those goals so they're aware of it. You also constantly want to have a check on whether or not you're leading your students to those goals, so that's why it's important to have them visually posted. So now it's your turn. I want you to create a slide or a poster that displays your objectives. If you're just working on your phone, you can absolutely just have it on the Notes app in your phone. If you've got a computer, pull up whatever slide presentation program you've got. And I'm going to give you 1 minute to do that, and then we're going to move on to the second part of this activity. So you have to be creative. You can write it down on a piece of paper, you can put it on your phone, but you want to have your objectives somewhere where you can visually show them to at least one other person in the room. All right, if you're not done, that's okay. We're going to pause. I'm going to give you the next set of instructions. So what you're going to do is you're going to get in groups of either 2 or 3 people, and every person is going to have an opportunity to practice the technique of going over the objectives at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the lesson. This is a little bit contrived because you're not actually teaching a lesson, you're just pretending you're at each part in the lesson. But if you do it now, it won't feel so awkward the next time that you're teaching. It can actually feel a little weird to be like, I know we just went over these, but we're going to go over them again. So what you're going to do is you're going to pull up your objectives, and you as the presenter are going to say, all right, welcome to class. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to do 1, 2, and 3. And then you'll pause, and you'll imagine that you've just covered your first objective, and you'll say, so we just went over the first objectives that you can describe, or you can write 2 to 3 learning objectives that meet the 4M criteria. And you pause, and you say, all right, so we've wrapped up our lesson. Let's review our learning objectives here at the end. Can I have somebody summarize what you're going to do when you're in your groups? Kyle?
We're going to show our partner the slide or poster or other visual tool that has our objectives on them, and then we're going to practice what stating those objectives looks like at the beginning, middle, and end of the lesson.
Absolutely. So you're doing the visual part, and you're doing the verbal part. So I'm going to we'll start with 5 minutes. If we need more, we'll take it. When you are the person presenting, you should stand up. Very rarely are you teaching something and you're sitting down, so make this practice as authentic as possible. 5 minutes on the clock, go.
Teach.
Oh, no. components to Post-it. One is the visual component, that you're displaying your objectives and referring back to them. And then there's a verbal component where either you or you're asking a student to say, hey, these are the goals, let's talk about them at the beginning of the lesson, the middle of the lesson, and the end of the lesson. I'm curious what that was like for you, and so I'd like to do some shout outs. Who had a partner who did something really well? And describe as much as you can what they did well, whether it was their tone of voice or the way that they were referring to the objectives on their phone. Some shout outs, can be anyone. We'll go Aaron, Austin, and then Cass.
I want to shout out to
Matt?
Matt, enthusiastic, loud. That got me excited about the dom again. I don't know why we're getting excited about So I wanted to learn from Matt. I was disappointed that his lesson didn't really end up.
We didn't even cover Dom.
Yeah.
We had nothing to do with Dom.
Yes.
So that's actually really nice because if your objectives are well written and you actually execute them well, your student's going to be able to do the things described in the objectives. That's incredibly powerful. Nice job, Matt. Austin.
Well, Kyle did an excellent job. Obviously, I think he's almost an expert. But I think the best part was when I got to go, he was able to kind of say like exactly what I kind of went off where I was supposed to. Be like, that's not it. This is like kind of like which was really nice.
What was something that you do differently now after Kyle's feedback?
Going into the beginning, middle, and ends, transitioning from the beginning to the middle. It was a little cloudy. And it's wrapping one objective and then putting another objective with that first one.
Okay, so you learned to tie a bow on like objective number 1 and then transition into objective number 2. Excellent. Cass, what did your partner do?
So my partner Bob went through everything just as he was supposed to, but then he added at the end, I think my lesson would be more personalized because he normally works with individuals instead of the class. And so he kind of started to brainstorm how he would, post objectives for an individual person. Maybe it'd be more of bringing them back to their own computer in that case. I thought that was great to be thinking about that.
Yeah, so you may be teaching in a situation where you're tutoring or you're working with somebody one-on-one. Learning objectives are still powerful, but you don't stand in front of them and have a poster of them. So what do you think, Rob? If you were working with a student and you had learning objectives, how would you share them with them?
So I would typically when I teach, it's like I've been teaching at the job fairs and doing like objects and stuff. That's usually what they want to learn about. So like, all right, I had 72 minutes, saying them out loud, but in my mind I had like set of like things I would go through. So first I showed how to like define it, vertical, initialize it, and then how to like add keys and stuff. I would explain it as I was going through it, and like, this is what this is, and apply all this stuff.
So you were working one-on-one with someone learning about JavaScript objects, and you had objectives in your head.
Yeah.
Did you state them out loud to them? Or will you in the future?
Yeah. I just like when it happened, I would say it wasn't like beginning and after, but just in the middle is when I would say like, let's do this.
Absolutely. There's a lot of power in making those implicit goals explicit, because then the student is your partner in meeting those goals. It's not like, oh, I have to teach the student, they have to get there. They actually will take as much responsibility, if not more. Excellent work. So, we just covered objective number 2, that you can describe and demonstrate the teaching technique Post-it. The way that I was assessing you for your demonstrating was I walked around and I was looking and listening to see, were you doing the things? Were you pointing to objectives? Were you saying them out loud? One thing I haven't really seen you do or heard you do is describe the technique Post-it. So think about, how would you describe the technique if somebody asked you, hey, what's this deal with this Post-it technique? What does it mean? And then I want you to turn and talk with somebody you haven't talked to. You might have to get up and do that. But describe the technique Post-it to somebody who you haven't talked
No,
describe it in your own words. What's your name? Will. Can you describe in your own words the technique Postive?
Sure. Post-it is putting up the learning objectives visually for everyone to see,
Putting up the learning objectives visually for everyone to see. Yes.
walking through them at the beginning,
Walking through them at the beginning.
highlighting the ones you covered as you go through the lesson,
Highlighting them as you go through the lesson.
and doing a recap at the end to
Oh.
repeat everything.
Give Will a round of applause. So good. That was like the textbook answer to that question. I'm looking for a non-textbook answer to that question. Maybe a sentence or less. Like when Peter described learning objectives, he said it in a way that I wouldn't say it, and I took a lot out of it. So a different definition of Post-it. Or maybe you kind of describe like what we're trying to get at with that technique. Take a volunteer for this one. What's your name?
Gabriel,
Gabriel.
I would say gaining collaboration from your learners and your students.
Ooh, getting collaboration from your students by.
Yeah, by establishing rules that you, or guidelines, goals that you check back in with them throughout the lesson.
Oh, that really gets at the heart of it. So he said by gaining collaboration from your students by having guidelines and goals that you're always checking back in on. Nice, give him a round of applause. Yeah, what Gabriel is getting at is that the students have to be active in the learning process. In fact, when a lesson occurs, they should be much more active than you as the instructor. So I did all of my work before this session. I thought about the learning objectives, I planned the activities, and right now it's actually kind of easy and not boring for me, but I'm not like doing a huge performance up here. So gaining collaboration, that's why we post learning objectives. Excellent work. All right, we have one final objective for this workshop. It's that you can describe and demonstrate the teaching technique called targeted questioning. So this is a quote from Doug Lamar, the author of Teach Like a Champion. Cass, will you read this quote for me?
Perhaps the most salient characteristic of a great teacher is her ability to recognize the difference between I taught it and they learned it.
Thank you. So a great teacher doesn't say, I taught it, I'm done. Some people got it, some people didn't. It doesn't matter, I did my job. A great teacher says, I presented the lesson, and then I'm going to check and see whether or not my students learned it, and if they didn't learn it, I'm going to teach it again and again and again. So that is great teaching. Did the student learn it? So the overarching technique for this is called checking for understanding, and it's you actually giving students an assessment or giving a test to get data back to say, did my students achieve the learning objectives that I outlined? The most common way that you probably experienced this in school was you were given an assessment by the instructor and it was graded by that person after class. And then you got back a piece of paper or something on a computer that gave you a score. Another way to do this is actually in the classroom in real time. It's a real-time check for understanding where you're asking questions and getting data back from the students and then being able to make really intelligent decisions about your instruction based on that data that you're getting live and in the classroom. And so one of those techniques is called targeted questioning. I've been doing it quite a bit in this lesson, and instructionally it's my favorite tool. And so when you ask a targeted question, this is the way that you do it. Step one, you ask the question aloud. It's actually really simple. If you want to be really lazy like me, you look at your learning objectives and you sort of like take that objective and turn it into a question. Step two, and this is the one that will probably be the hardest thing for you, is you provide wait time. So if I say, describe the technique Post-it Matt, don't actually So when I said Matt, or I didn't give you any time to think, first of all, when I said Matt, everyone else in the room went, woo, and stopped thinking. But you stop thinking, and so what you want students to do is really be thinking about that question, and so you have to provide wait time, you have to be silent, and you have to give time people to think. The third thing is you want to then collect that data. And so one way you can collect the data is through asking people to turn and talk. Now, turning and talking is a great way for people to process that information, but if you want to collect data, you actually have to go and listen to the people who are turning and talking. Another way you can collect data is a technique called show me. And so if you work in a classroom that has many whiteboards, or you have some software where students can submit their answer, you can literally visually see all of the data that you're getting back from your students. The last technique that you can use, and there are many more than these three, but these are the ones that are simplest for me to explain, is called cold calling. And that's where you select a student to talk. And so if I say, describe the technique, post it in your own words, step one. This is step two. It's very, very awkward. For you as the instructor, it's not awkward for your students. And then so the question was, describe the technique, post it in your own words. Matt, that would be a cold call. I selected one student out. Guess what? It's your turn! So what we're going to do is we're going to do a longer practice protocol. Ideally, you would be in a group of 2, but a group of 3 is fine. And so what's going to happen is you're going to pick one objective from the list of objectives that you wrote. You are then going to turn that objective into a targeted question. You're just imagining that you're sort of wrapping up that objective. You're going to ask the targeted question, you're going to wait, and then you're going to say, turn and talk with your neighbor, or you're going to cold call on a student. You only have one student, so do what you like. So you're going to do that once. You're going to do it once just to get it out of your system, because it's a little bit weird. Then you're going to do it again. Exact same thing, exact same question. You ask the question, you provide wait time, and then you collect the data. And then after that, the person watching you is going to give you feedback. Only one piece of critical feedback. So you'll say, one thing I liked was the way that you provided a lot of wait time. One thing I would do differently is do a turn and talk before you do a cold call. So one thing that they did well, one thing that they would change. And then step 3 is that you do it again. You would ask the exact same question in the exact same way, but this time you're implementing the feedback that your partner gave you. So you're going to do that protocol. This protocol is a little weird. I'm just curious, how did I explain it? So can somebody describe in their own words, what are you going to do when I split you into this practice time? Can you tell me your name again? Yeah.
Chris.
Chris, what's the practice going to look like?
So we're going to start out by asking a target question based off of our objectives that we've set for ourselves in the first place.
Yep, you're going to look at your objectives, turn one into a targeted question.
We're going to take some time and wait for a couple seconds.
You give that wait time.
And then we're going to target somebody or have our students turn to a partner and answer the question.
Excellent. You give me a great description of the targeted questioning technique. I want someone else to describe the protocol that we're going to use to practice. So it's this thing on the board. It sounds ridiculous. I basically want you to say what's on the screen. Austin, how's this going to work?
I can say. You're going to ask targeted question. It's going to be from our objectives. We're going to do it again after we get it out of our system.
You just get it out of your system because it's weird.
Yeah. We're going to get some feedback, some critical or constructive criticism from one student, and then we're going to try it again and try to apply it.
Absolutely. So Cass, when you come up here, we're just going to demonstrate what this looks like. So Cass is the teacher. I'm the person watching her, giving feedback. All right, round 1.
Okay.
Okay, cutscene, pretend she did it. So that was her round 1. Round 2, she does the exact same thing again. Cutscene, and I say, Cass, I really liked how you were standing. You looked very confident. One thing I would do differently is give more wait time. And then number 3. Excellent. And then we switch. Give Cass a round of applause. Oh gosh, we gotta go. I'm gonna put 7 minutes on the clock. You're gonna find a partner. You're gonna run through this protocol. You're practicing how to ask a targeted question. Go. And when you're teaching, you're standing.